2014 East Pacific hurricane season. In a couple of weeks, it'll be time for the Atlantic hurricane season, and this video blog will cover both areas of interest, the Eastern Pacific Basin and the Atlantic Basin. For right now, this is the beginning of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, so I thought I would take a look at a couple of things related to climatology, the names that we will be using this year in the Eastern Pacific, and then, of course, a look at current conditions. This is the area that we're talking about right now, the Eastern Pacific. This is part of the area of responsibility for the National Hurricane Center, which is located here in Miami, Florida. They have the Atlantic Basin and the Eastern Pacific Basin. Once we get to the Central Pacific Hurricane Center out of Hawaii handles Central Pacific tropical cyclones. And then in the Western Pacific, that's a totally different area of responsibility depending on what nation or nations are affected or might be affected. You have Japan with the Japanese Meteorological Agency. You have the Philippines with, it's called PAGASA, Pagasa, if I am pronouncing that correctly. In other words, there's a lot of different entities that are responsible for tropical cyclone forecasts in the Western Pacific, and of course there's even the Joint Typhoon Warning Service, or Warning Center. So right now, though, we're most interested in the Eastern Pacific region, which is this area, and you can see, looking at climatology, most of the tracks, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, if this will allow me, there we go. Most of the tracks of Eastern Pacific storms, generally away from land for the most part, but once in a while, when you get a good trough carving in here, you can get one of these systems turning into Mexico, sometimes into Central America, and maybe once in a while up towards the Baja, and really rare occasion up into Southern California. Now, oftentimes we'll get moisture coming from these systems streaming up into the southwest United States, especially early in the season like now, and then later in the season when we get these big troughs digging in out west, helping to stream some of that moisture north. We could certainly use that right now with all the heat and fire, dry conditions in the southwest United States, San Diego, and Southern California as a whole. We could use some of that tropical moisture. Unfortunately, there's none to be found right now. So, what do the points of origin look like this time of year? This is the May 10th through the 20th time frame, and these are all the different tropical cyclones when they got their start in the Atlantic Basin here and the Eastern Pacific. And just focusing on the Eastern Pacific, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points of origin over the last 100 years or so that have all developed here in the Eastern Pacific. Now, as I go through this over the next several months, you'll notice, obviously, how much this fills in with lots and lots of these red dots. And what this means is that this time frame here, May 10th through the 20th, typically we don't see that much activity. Maybe one every year during this time frame, somewhere down here in the Southeast Pacific Ocean. Not a prolific development is what I'm trying to say. When we get to August and September, of course, this will be very full of red dots or points of origins. So, what are the names this year? Well, the first name in the Eastern North Pacific will be Amanda. And then Boris, Christina, Douglas, Alida, Fausto, Genevieve, Hernan, Isel, Julio, Karina, Lowell, Marie, Norbert, Odile, or Odile, Odile, something. Sorry, can't pronounce all these. Polo, Rachel, Simon, Trudy, Vance, Winnie, Xavier, Yolanda, and Zeke. Only that one that I have trouble pronouncing. How many of these will we use? Probably quite a few. Typically, in an active season, we could go through maybe 15 named storms. So somewhere maybe down to the P area or so. We'll see. But the very first one hasn't been named yet. We have not had a named storm in the Eastern Pacific just yet. But it will be Amanda, and then Boris and Christina, so we'll keep an eye on that. Looking at the current conditions, what's going on out there, well, one of the things I like to look at in these updates is the sea surface temperature anomalies, what we call departures from normal or departures from average. and we see this developing El Nino here in the tropical Pacific. That may add some more, I guess you could call it prowess to the eastern Pacific season, because we have this anomalously, that's what we call an anomaly, anomalously warm water above normal. That's what these reds and oranges are showing. And this is due to a change in the ocean state and the atmosphere out here in the eastern Pacific and the central and western Pacific as a whole, where it allows the water to warm up more so than normal along the equator. Unrelated to that is the warm water that we see here right off the coast of Mexico, for example. And then generally the whole Pacific here, the North Pacific anyway, running a little bit warmer than it should be. Quite a contrast to the cold, what we call Pacific decadal oscillation that we've seen, cold PDO, in the Pacific over the last several years. Now the South Pacific, nice and chilly down here. And it's interesting to see that this El Nino continues to try to develop. How strong it gets and what influence it has remains to be seen, as we're just now getting started with the East Pacific hurricane season. But these waters, right here off the coast of Mexico and just north of the equator here, running warmer than the long-term average. So we may see an additional named storm or two or three and maybe some intense hurricanes because of this. But that's not always a guarantee. Warmer water does not always equal more tropical cyclones. You have to have light winds in the upper atmosphere, moisture available in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. A dry mid-level to the atmosphere doesn't allow for deep thunderstorms to develop, and other factors that go into this. But right now, conditions are pretty much primed for something to get going. We just need a pre-existing disturbance. Do we have such? Not quite yet. This is a satellite shot, an infrared satellite shot in black and white, showing just a small cluster of thunderstorms here well to the southwest of Mexico. Another cluster of limited convection way out in the central Pacific. But again, this is the region that we're most interested in here, the eastern North Pacific Ocean. Some more convection here to the south and west of Central America. But right now, the upward motion in the atmosphere, what we call the Madden-Julian oscillation, is not favoring widespread deep convective activity or deep thunderstorms in the eastern tropical Pacific. So, for the next several days at least, it looks like that we will not be seeing any threats for development, and that should remain the case probably through the weekend, which is good news, right? Now, as I said, it would be nice to get something to develop and maybe get some moisture to get pulled up into Southern California. But this time of year, that's going to be hard to do. Maybe later towards August and September, some of these systems can form and they get drawn northward as a trough digs in, perhaps. But right now, we're seeing a very large ridge of high pressure over the western United States, and that's what's responsible for this dry, sinking air that's very, very volatile for fire conditions, and that would tend to steer anything that develops this way, because high pressure blows clockwise in the northern hemisphere. We need to see a big storm system like this carve out in the west to draw any tropical moisture up north. So for the time being, things nice and quiet in the eastern North Pacific. No worries to be concerned about. All right, well, this update this is the first one today, Thursday, the 15th of May. They'll be normally every Monday before noon Eastern Time. I'll post these to the Hurricane Pro and Hurricane HD apps, and they'll be once a week. But if something develops, then we need to keep an eye on it. Then we can go to checking things out every day, make sure you're aware of what's going on. And then, of course, when we get into the Atlantic hurricane season, June 1st, the same thing applies. This will be once a week, every Monday before noon, and I'll cover the Atlantic Basin, the Eastern Pacific Basin, and if something develops and we need to keep an eye on it, these updates will be more frequent. All right, so be sure to check the app and any push notifications that are sent out about when different video blogs are posted, and you will be in the know. And also, every once in a while, I'll throw in some hurricane preparedness tips and things of that nature when everything is really quiet and there's not much else to talk about. All right, well, welcome to the 2014 East Pacific hurricane season. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. That is my website. and it is an honor to be back again producing these videos for Hurricane Pro and Hurricane HD. Probably the best hurricane tracking apps on the market, bar none. And that is not just my paid endorsement saying that. They are fantastic, and I am very glad that you're making use of them, and we'll see how much use you have to get out of them this season. It could be a busy East Pacific season, and we'll just have to wait and see about the Atlantic. Remember, it only takes one, especially where you live, and that's what we're going to be most focused on, is what might happen to you. So we'll see about that. All right? Have a good rest of your Thursday. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you again more on Monday.